So just a little bit, if you can see there, what we're looking at tonight is the idea that you can actually build integrity into the way that the actual company or the organization operates. And the reason we're taking this approach tonight is, I think when we had our FPIN original meeting in Oxford, I think it was exactly 4 years ago, in 2016, as I recall. We talked a lot about integrity in different ways. And then I was very privileged to go across to the Philippines last year and sit or work with Amajay and Niels over there. And they talked a lot about personal integrity, working with senior government officials. But what I was aware of was that when those officials, those individuals of integrity move on, often the whole thing that they did falls apart. And what we are looking to do actually is to build in integrity into the way the organization operates on a day-to-day basis. And that really needs to be done through a combination of policies, procedures, monitoring and enforcement, training, communication, and things like tone from the top. So when you build it that way, it's a bit more robust and a bit more long lasting, and also a bit clearer for people. It's not quite as arbitrary because it's working on things that the organization have approved, normally at the top level, like the board. So that's why we're talking about institutions of integrity. And I'm going to look at two different systems. One is what we're using here in Malaysia, and the other is the ISO 37001, which is the international standard for these programs. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to run through the slides fairly quickly because I want us to have time for discussion. So this is the question I'm looking for. How do you establish long-term, effective, systematic anti-corruption programs which protect the organization regardless of who is at the top, or in the middle, or at the bottom? So that's the objective that we're talking about, and how do we do that? So I mentioned I was going to show you a picture of my family. Here they are. This was actually taken 2 years ago. We've got another picture coming up. So little Iona there, she's now 2 and running around. Matthias in the middle, he's 7, and Luke is 4. Deborah, my wife, is actually Malaysian. And just very briefly, I'm from the UK. I have a PhD in doctrinal theology, which I hadn't done much. I'm more from the business sector. But I came out to do some teaching in 2009 with 2 seminaries here, teaching doctrinal theology. And then I ended up meeting Deborah, staying more long-term, and then being drawn into this work through Transparency International. So I worked for the Malaysian chapter and set up a consultancy operation there, helping companies establish anti-corruption programs. Then we did a management buyout in 2015 and set up Trident. So I'm the principal owner and the lead consultant for Trident. And I've got 3 full-time staff and also 3 freelancers who are experts in corruption risk assessments and very recently data analytics and artificial intelligence. So looking at how data can be used to identify and deal with corruption. So that's that's a bit just really about my background. Okay, I'm just going to make a slight change. Okay, so that's me. Over the years, we've worked with quite a number of companies. I think most of these you won't know. But they include some of the biggest companies in Malaysia, especially the state-owned enterprise. We've got a few investment companies in there. So this KSWP is actually the National Pension Fund. Tenaga is the National Power Corporation. They've got about 35,000 staff. That was our biggest project. So we did it for the whole company, and that took about 2 years. And then others here, you've got the regulators, which is the Security Commission. Sime Darby, they had 130,000 employees when we did their program, so a huge company. That was the biggest company in Malaysia at that time. And then we've also done work with other companies, including a few SMEs as well. So most of our work is with bigger corporates. I've also done work, a little bit of international work in Afghanistan, Mongolia, Bhutan, and the Philippines. So, but most of it's in Malaysia with state-owned enterprise, some internationals as well. Nestle's on there. Okay, so thinking about this from a corporate perspective, this is the current list of FCPA prosecutions from the United States. You can see a couple of things here. One is that the fines are very substantial these days. So this is getting companies very anxious about being caught up in bribery and corruption incidents. And this is proving to be one of the main drivers for demand for our work. because we operate 100% consultancy. We don't get any grants. Everything that we earn is through working on a consultancy and training basis. So these companies obviously got caught out. Other companies see this and get concerned whether they might get caught out too. And also American, British and French companies are increasingly hot on companies they work with in other countries also having anti-corruption programs. So these fines are one of the main drivers for our work. The other main driver is there's actually recently introduced laws in Malaysia, which means that if a company is caught out acting with corruption to win or retain business, the directors and top management can be jailed, whether or not they even knew about it or were involved. So that's that's the other main driver for our work at the moment. That legislation is quite rare in this part of the world, but at least we have it here in Malaysia, whatever else we have problems with. Very briefly, what we're talking about with corruption, we're talking about a specific category. So we all know what corruption means, but I use this as a definition. So anything giving or receiving something of value in an attempt to illicitly influence the decisions or actions of a person in a position of trust. In the corporate sector, we talk about two forms: outbound. This is where someone is using bribery and corruption to win or retain business with an external party. Typically, outbound corruption is targeting government officials to get licenses, contracts, or permits, or a client decision maker. Usually that's in the area of sales and business development. So the other form of corruption is what we call inbound. This is where an external party uses corruption to influence someone within the company to their own advantage. And this is typically focused on procurement. Now, if we look at FCPA and UK Bribery Act convictions against companies, it is really talking about outbound corruption. So this is where companies are using bribery and corruption to win or retain business. So outbound corruption is also the focus of the legislation here in Malaysia. Inbound is more common for the government, more of a problem for the government sector because they're usually the victims. But the risks are different. So for outbound, the risk is prosecution risk and reputation risk. Inbound, the risk is increased prices and or reduced quality. So these two different categories of corruption actually require fundamentally different approaches. And the anti-corruption systems I'll be explaining a little bit later on focus primarily on outbound. Okay, of course, feel free to put a question in the chat box if you want to ask me something. Okay, I'm just bringing up the list again. Sorry, for some reason it's not working. Oh, there we go. Okay, now just briefly about the Malaysian program. This is the structure that the Malaysian government have provided for us to work to, and it provides quite a structural approach. So about half our projects are implementing these programs with companies, and some of them are larger companies as well. So we start with top level commitment. So we need the buy-in from the top. I'll cover each one of these briefly, by the way, just so you know what it's about. Risk assessment, so seeing what the corruption risks are, the control measures that they need to put in place, the review, monitoring and enforcement program, and then training and communication. So that's what we need to do. And for Malaysia, these need to be reasonable and proportionate to the size of the organization. Otherwise, they aren't considered adequate. So what that means is for small businesses, maybe NGOs as well, they can be quite simple. So I actually do a program with the Companies Commission Malaysia here, where we make it accessible for small businesses. So we charge about $300 for a 2-day training program, which includes all the simple templates that they can implement for themselves. And then I provide the templates and then can provide consultancy on the spot over those 2 days so that the people attending can develop their own procedures. So that's one end of the scale. And at the other end of the scale are these very large scale programs like we did for TMB and a few other companies, which take maybe a year and a half to put in place. And they're much more expensive, of course. So this principle of reasonable, proportionate helps small businesses do it cheaply, and big businesses where the real challenges are, they have to do it more extensively. Okay, so let's look briefly at what these take in turn. So the first, as we know, tone from the top is very critical. So top level commitments where it starts. So we need to start our work, we really need some kind of buy-in or resolution from the board. So it's normally a board resolution or a minuted board requirement to establish the program. What we've found really is without that, we're wasting our time. So without that top level commitment, it just becomes a bit of a paper exercise. But I'm glad to say that this corporate liability law means that the directors themselves are now quite nervous. So they are actually issuing these instructions. So then they need to assign a competent function. This is quite key because if the person in charge of the program really isn't up to the job, then it's not very effective. So that's the next stage for them. And it would normally be under compliance, very occasionally internal audit, or the state-owned enterprises here have an integrity and governance unit set up by the government. So we tend to use those. Then they have to establish their lines of authority, which I'll come to in a second. But the key element of that is they need to report directly to the board, or if they're not the board, the audit and risk management committee, which is a standard part of a listed company here. So the audit committee is a standard listing requirement, and normally they are the ones who take it, sometimes the risk management committee. They need to also encourage the use of whistleblowing. I'll touch on that a little bit later. And then the monitoring program needs to be reported to the top management and the main board, because they are the ones who can be prosecuted directly for corruption. We also, they're also required under the regulations to demonstrate personal integrity. Now we're actually developing a program on what that looks like in practice. And it's things like keeping your word, not cheating on your expenses, starting meeting on time, not claiming that it's your idea when it's somebody else's idea. So we've actually developed an assessment checklist, which runs to about 40 items, which we're just about to introduce a training program aimed at senior management and directors, which will include using this checklist to see whether they really are people of integrity or they're just pretending. So we've been doing a lot of research on that. So that's quite fun. And that's what that section's about. The key we found to this, apart from the board resolution, is this line of authority. Because if they don't have that, then it's very easy for the top management to squash the people in charge of the program and give the impression that everything is okay to the board, when actually there are real problems going on. So this is a kind of structure that we tend to end up with. So the person in the middle is the key person, if you like, the person in charge of it, usually a compliance officer. They are normally quite senior, reporting to the managing director or the CEO, but they also have the authority to report directly to either the board or the audit committee or both. So that access to top level independent non-executive directors is what guarantees their autonomy and helps with their effectiveness. And we found that to be quite critical. We've worked on companies where the CEO was actually the problem. Okay, I'm just picking up a couple of chats. Okay, I'm just checking the chat group. Okay, these are good questions. So I just give a couple of more things about the compliance structure, and then I'll come back to those chat group questions. So you can see that the compliance officer is there in the middle. You can see down below that these other departments also play a very key role, because the compliance officer or the integrity unit just can't manage it themselves. It has to be a company-wide effort. And for that, we compare it to health and safety. Health and safety isn't just the job of one department. It's the role of every manager. And we say that integrity is very much the same. Okay, so I've got a couple of things here. Sorry, I'll just, okay. Alianza, okay, just reading your note. Thank you for your presentation. As you work with organizations, do you work from universal standards on building trust within the structure? Okay, that's a very interesting question. I'm going to touch on the ISO 37001 later, Alianza. So if you're okay with it, I'll come back to your question then, because the ISO, it's by no means perfect, but it does provide a general standard that we work to. And actually we use the ISO when we implement even these adequate procedures programs. So I'll come back to that. Roberto, okay, that's another good question. So who appoints the compliance officer? It's normally recommended by the CEO and approved by the board, but it can be recommended by the head of compliance or another person. But that board approval is quite key, because we have come across cases where the management, even at the top level, have been directly involved in corruption. So the ability to intimidate or remove the compliance officer can be, that needs to be well protected. Otherwise, they can be very easily victimized. So yes, for private sector companies, the board are the right people to do that. And that's part of that tone from the top. They get it right. Okay, Kelly, person integrity checklist, how to control for social desirability. Yeah, I have to say, literally, we just did it. What is it today? Thursday? Is it Wednesday? We just finished this off on Monday. So right now, it's very much something like a personal tool. It's really right now. It's really about getting people to think about it, because it's very new here. This whole idea. We have thought about doing 360-degree reviews from their peer group, their boss, and their subordinates. But frankly, if we try and do that, we're going to get practically zero take-up, because people are going to be too worried about the results. So I think we have to start with something that's practical, and then we can progress a bit further. But one tool that we do use are actually online surveys using survey platforms like SurveyMonkey. And that can bring out things which people perhaps wouldn't like us to know, but the survey picks them up. Okay, hopefully, Kelly, that deals with your question. Okay, Zero again. Board governance standards for non-profits in Latin America. Now then, non-profits. I have to say, because we operate with the commercial sector, I'm not sure about non-profits. One thing I might suggest is that the big four, like KPMG, for example, I think they produce board standards for the commercial sector. Whether or not they could be directly used for non-profits, I don't know really. But that might be an option. I'm just trying to think whether, here in Malaysia, we have the Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance, which is issued by the Securities Commission, the regulator. I'm very happy to share that with you if it's any use. So if you want to, then drop me an email and I can pick it up for you tomorrow. Okay, hope that will do something. Actually, this whole area of board governance is absolutely critical because if the board is getting it wrong, then you can't expect much from anybody else, I would say. So I think that's where we're focusing our attention increasingly. Okay, so drop me an email and I'll drop you what I can back to you. Okay. All right, let's head back into the presentation for a bit. So now that I'll just zoom this out. Okay, so now that we've got your top level commitment established, we can go on to do this risk assessment. So it's actually a part of the normal enterprise risk management process to a degree, but it's a little bit specialist in the fact that it's talking about a particular subject matter. And what we find, and this is quite critical, is that the corruption risk assessment is basically the foundation of the program. If the corruption risk assessment is partial or inaccurate or weak, then we find that we can't develop the right system for the company. So we do take quite a long time over this. Normally a corruption risk assessment will take about 6 to 8 weeks just for that one piece of work to get it right. And we do quite a lot of the work on a kind of cooperative working basis. For the Malaysian standard, they have to do a comprehensive risk assessment at least once every 3 years. And for larger companies, actually once a year is much more suitable. And in some companies, it will be even once every 6 months on certain areas. But at least once a year at the moment is more accurate. So we want to include a few things. So opportunities for corruption due to things like a policy missing. So if there's no gifts and hospitality policy, for example, then it's a free-for-all. Financial transactions which may disguise corruption payments, that takes a bit of an art, to be frank, because they're often quite well disguised. They may be processed as training or consultancy or other kind of fabricated statements. So they require a little bit of expertise, but we do training for the companies to help them with that. Of course, some areas are more risky than others. So government contracting is usually the most risky part. And also risk assessments for the kind of external parties that could get the company into trouble, particularly agents and other such parties, because agents are, in our legislation anyway, like the FCPA, if an agent acts on your behalf, then you are liable for the corruption. And supply chain as well. Supply chain can be inbound, so supply chain can target the procurement division with gifts and hospitality, offers to pay for the holiday, the house renovation, the school fees. You get me the job, I'll look after you. But they can also be outbound, where for example, a logistics service provider, which guarantees to get your goods through the dock within 5 working days, because they're paying off the officials at the port. But their work as freight agents also means that you are personally liable under this legislation. So all these things need to be thought through. So this is a sample of a corruption risk assessment. You can see this is usually what we get the first time round. So right at the top there, you've got number 6, which is the numbering is just in terms of what came out during the interviews and the workshop. So this one came out as use of government liaison specialists who are likely to pay bribes to win or retain government contracts. So number 8 is a little bit the same, company personnel using bribery to government officials to secure permit and license renewal. And number 11 down there, bribing government official to approve payment for incomplete or substandard work. So these are all high risk because they are all outbound corruption. And outbound corruption in Malaysia now carries personal liability for the directors, as I've said. So this is the one that the board, or these are the ones that the board will be most worried about. Number 1 and number 7 are actually more to do with inbound. So leaking tender specifications, number 1 there. And number 7, collusion with the site manager to accept substandard goods. These are to do with procurement and goods received. So still quite serious, but not with the same catastrophic potential that number 6 has, for example, or major at least. So once we've done the risk assessment, we've got a pretty good idea of where the challenges for the company are, and then we can move on to actually developing the controls, which is the next step. So for our programs, this is what we're talking about. It's quite comprehensive. When I show you the ISO program in a minute, it actually covers more ground than this, but these cover the main areas. So that policy, due diligence, some kind of procedure to assess whether the companies that you are or other organizations you're seeking to work with are genuine or not. Whistleblowing and reporting, conflicts of interest, gifts, entertainment. Donations and sponsorships is a high risk area because for companies, they may make donations to charities which aren't charities at all. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So, you know, the orphanage, which has no children and no building, for example, $50,000 very kindly donated, and then it gets siphoned off. So the so-called orphanage has a maintenance contract with another company, which charges them $48,000 for nothing at all, and that gets into the hands of the politician. So all these things have to be carefully managed. These facilitation payments, small payments to get things done. Financial and non-financial controls, very key, of course. The system improvement and record keeping are more back end. So this is the main structure. Just checking if there's any more chats. Not at the moment. Okay. I'm just going to show you a couple of the controls. We're over halfway through now, so as I say, I wanted to run through quickly and give you an overall flavour, and then we can go to Q&A. So in that main statement, this is normally published on the company website, by the way, so it tends to be a bit more high level, but it should cover all these, the main grounds. So the clear statement, normally it's something like this company has a zero tolerance for corruption or something like that. A commitment to ensure the company has suitable, what we call integrity infrastructure. So these are all the policies and procedures. So also doing that corruption risk assessment, having a compliance function which reports to the board, those policies and procedures, and then the monitoring, enforcement and reporting structure, and the promise to support staff who refuse to pay bribes and so on. We also tend to include sanctions for non-compliance, both for staff and for external parties like vendors or contractors. So this is a clear statement which sets out the company's position, downloadable from the website usually, and then the company can use this for training and also for stakeholder management. And the details of a lot of these will be in the other policies which aren't necessarily included. So the main challenge areas that I mentioned, gifts, entertainment, hospitality and travel. Golf in Malaysia is always a problem. Government officials are demanding or expecting you to take them out for golf, sometimes once a week. And golf games cost between what, $200 to $300 a time here for the good courses. So what do you do with that? Do you say no and upset them and they make your life hell, or do you say yes and then get into trouble? Interesting enough, the MACC, or the enforcement body, tend to hang out at the golf courses and see who's actually on the course with who, and then they use that and go back and see what's really going on. Donations, sponsorships, political donations, we mentioned these facilitation payments. So we tend to spend more time on these policies than pretty well any other, because especially having a facilitation payments policy can be quite tough to get right unless you want to stop the business in its tracks. So you have to think about these things quite carefully. And these are all the kind of things that we mean by gifts and hospitality, hampers, cash, electronic items, watches, sometimes non-tangible, so holidays or school fees. Occasionally it's a car, not always a Porsche, sometimes it's a Mercedes, sometimes it's even a yacht or even an airplane for the big deals. You know, these are sometimes these are $1 billion deals. So free use of the private jet comes as part of the package. I'm just going to touch on whistleblowing very quickly. This is actually a whistleblowing system from NAVEX, which is a global supplier. So some big companies like Coca-Cola, they don't actually do it themselves. They outsource it to an external party. And if you go onto this particular site where it says select language, if you click the drop-down box, it'll show you about 20 to 25 languages, including Arabic and Sanskrit and these other Chinese, Japanese, Korean. So this is a kind of a global service provider, and the big companies tend to use them. At the other end of the scale, this is from an SME here. This is one of our early projects that we put in place back in 2011. And you can see that people have different options. We tend to find that hand phone numbers work well because people know that they can call, in this case, the chairman directly and explain what's going on, and that their report will be taken seriously. Of course, this won't work for a major company. The chairman is not going to give his hand phone number out, but it might be, for example, the hand phone number of the head of compliance, or very occasionally a senior independent director. So the whistleblowing procedure is normally looked after by the chairman of the audit committee or the chairman of the risk committee, depending on the company. And they would be an independent non-executive director. So they are completely outside the operations of the company, and that provides a degree of assurance. We work on the 4 to 6 eyes principle. So a minimum of 2 people involved in handling the reports. That means that if it's just one person and that person is implicated, or a friend of theirs is implicated in the report, then they can suppress it. But if 2 people see it, then it's much more difficult. Up to 3 people would get to see the original report for a bigger company. More than 3 is a security risk, so we don't recommend any more than 3 people get to know who submitted the report. Okay, so this is just a sample. I can't go into everything, of course, because it would take too long, but that gives you an idea. Then once you've got these things in place, you do your review. So these performance reviews help work out whether your system's really working. So you have a formalized monitoring program, including auditing. You need the right people, so they have to be trained and know what to look for and how to do the auditing. And they should be doing it fairly continually to identify the challenge areas and improvements. One thing that's very critical for the success of the system is that people genuinely understand what this is all about. Sorry, Kelly, I just noticed your, okay, so a bit of a dig at Coca-Cola there. Perhaps I'll come back to that later. So monitoring personal performance, do they really get it? And also, are they seeing things being done that shouldn't be done? So we use these online surveys for that, and we found those to be very effective. We've done that with a number of companies, and it doesn't give a 100% picture, but it gives a reasonably good snapshot of where they are at the moment and what the problems are. And then that enforcement, which is very critical. If you don't enforce it, people don't take it seriously and ignore it. So the enforcement, including actually publicizing the results of people, if someone's been fired, you might not name them, but you might well say 3 people were terminated this month because of bribery issues, and that tends to get people's attention. The other thing that we are looking at, risk assessments, yeah, I've covered that a bit already, using whistleblower reports, but the area that we're focusing quite a lot now is this whole area of technology. So data analytics is the new field for us. We started working on this actually about a year ago. I think I talked to you, Benji, about it, didn't I? So data analytics, potentially very, very useful. We've had our first meetings with companies to do this, so I've got a specialist on board to do it. So he basically is an expert in process mining. So for example, you can work out using the data in the system where people are bucking the trend. So if 98% of transactions are following a specific flow, but 2% are outside that mainstream, then you can investigate the exceptions, and you tend to pick up a lot of misconduct or malpractice through those exceptions. So that exception reporting, it takes a while to build, but once you've got it, then you can run it repeatedly, and then you can identify, especially, for example, if out of those 300 exceptions, 160 come from one particular person, then you know who to talk to and who to look at. Incidentally, we can also use artificial intelligence now to identify the relationship map of a whole organization, including the supply chain. So that's an interesting service that we're looking to offer, so that people can work out if, for example, somebody on the C-suite of a company is the brother of a company in the supply chain. So that data is quite readily available. Okay, do later. Process mining, yeah. So sorry, process mining is it's a bit like data mining, but what you do with process mining is you're picking up on individual points of data in the system. So it might be in, say, an Oracle system, and the algorithm will show the process that's actually being taken by people in practice. So these larger companies normally have a process flow, but in practice, people may do something quite different, or they may use weaknesses in the system. So one area that can be checked, for example, is, are you getting a lot of invoices through which are at $49,500? And then, of course, the limit of authority for a certain level of management is 50,000. So that shows you that people are splitting the invoices down to bypass the procurement process, and then you can check that out. So process mining creates like a mainstream, and then, as I say, you can identify the exceptions, and it's part of data analytics. Yeah. Okay, once you've got that in, looking at training and communication. So this is quite key. So you got to tell people of what you can and can't do. So newsletters, team meetings, briefings, intranet, portals, and so on. We only normally do training for the specialist functions. This is part of the risk assessment, so that they can work out, you can work out who is most exposed, and then do, for example, scenario training. That's what I was doing earlier today. So I was just saying to Benji, I spent most of today doing online training where we will look at maybe 12 or 14 scenarios related to a specific function or team, and they have to work out what to do. And that tends to work quite well. And then some companies train vendors and agents. It's quite rare, to be honest. It's usually too much of a job, but at least having some kind of letter or communication to them, which they have to sign and return to maintain their vendor registration, agreeing not to use bribery and corruption. That can help too. Very quickly, this is one of our recent projects. This is actually the main highway concession company. They operate the highway between Thailand and Singapore, which is, I guess, about 800 kilometers long. So we just did this. These guys got ISO certified in June, and they transferred sort of some of their key policies into this pretty booklet. So each item has a description. What is this all about? Then they have a set of do's and don'ts, and then they have a set of scenarios. And we found this to be quite useful. You can actually download this if you're interested. If you put plus Berhad ABAC guide into Google, then it'll bring it up and you can take a look. Finally, thinking about the ABMS, this is the full structure. As you can see, it's a lot more complex than the adequate procedures, and it covers everything from initial terms and conditions through the context of the organization. That's really understanding what is the industry, what is it about, what does it do, who are the stakeholders. The whole area of leadership and governance and tone from the top is in there. Planning's just about the project. The HR section is in part 7, so all to do with having the right resources for the program, establishing standards of competence, having an employment process, training, communication, and so on. The main policies are in the do section, number 8. So conducting due diligence, financial, non-financial controls. 8.5, 8.6, and 8.8 are all to do with managing supply chain. So the supply chain element's quite strong in the ISO. And then that 8.7 is this crucial area of gifts, hospitality, and donations. Excuse me. Sections 9 and 10 are to do with the monitoring and enforcement. So how is that done? And again, that's quite detailed. So we find that to be quite useful when we're setting up the program. Okay, and then I'm just going to do this overlay. So the adequate procedures in Malaysia cover more or less about 80% of the ISO. And we designed it that way. I was on the committee that put that together. I can't remember if I mentioned that. So I work with the government anti-corruption center. So we designed it so that companies could start with the adequate procedures and then progress to the ISO if they needed to. Okay, that's the briefing. Hope it's useful. The point, going back to how we started, was the idea is that you develop the program and you establish it properly and thoroughly, and then you get it board approved. So once it's actually board approved, it's got a certain weight and authority, which means that it's hard to change. The reports are going to go to the top level. There's not much anyone can do to stop it. And so even if you have people who are a little bit dodgy, it's much more difficult for them to interfere too much with the program. Okay, I'll finish off. So let's switch to chat, and then we can see what kind of questions we've got. All right, so let me see how to. What have we got? Okay, so Eddie. Okay, one of the main findings of NGOs is the receipt of funds through money laundering. Yeah. What advice can you share for our network of Christian NGOs, taking into account that the need in a post-COVID-19 world increases, and many times care is not taken to know the origin of the funds? Yeah, NGOs, yeah, of course, non-government organizations. Yeah, that's certainly emerged as quite a strong challenge. I'm sure you've seen this, Benji, to some extent. I guess you've got to balance the need to do something for people who are really quite desperate with the importance of maintaining some degree of purity in your work. Reputation, of course, is very critical. And I think one thing that we see in this sector is that organizations can be really destroyed quite quickly if for example, a news report comes out linking them to anti-money laundering or to money laundering activities. So, of course, you can protest that you were just doing your best, but the bottom line is if you are used as a vehicle, it's going to do you quite a lot of damage. So I would say it depends on how much structure you have available. If it's a small NGO, I would guess that you're really focused on getting things done for people. We use Google, actually. Google's pretty effective as a due diligence tool. It's amazing how much information comes up within a second, and it's all free. So when we start working with any company, we just put the company name in and add the word corrupt and hit go and see what comes out. And that can be enough to tell you whether this is a problem organization or not. I would guess at the end of the day, you've just got to do your best and then get on with it. But the source of the funds, you know, if it's coming out of a well-known corrupt country like Malaysia, well, pretty well, if it's parts of Africa or Afghanistan or something like that, then of course you've got to be very careful. If it's coming from a country like the United States or the UK or Europe, then you can probably afford to be a bit more relaxed about it. So I think you just got to do your best, really. Okay. Hopefully that helps. Yeah. To what extent do you try to shape a culture? Oh, okay. Now this, Robert, this is absolutely critical. I think Roberto, there's another question about there about corruption is heavily cultural. I agree with that 100%. One of the challenges that we had earlier on in our program was that people would say, why are you trying to impose all these Western ideas on us? We've been doing business perfectly well for thousands of years based on relationships, and now you're introducing all this nonsense. So what to them is effective business working, to us is corruption. But I think my pushback to them was, well, look at what happens to your country. So we have a lot of Chinese people here. So the main pushback was from the Chinese. They had this view, it's all about relationships, which is to some extent true. But does that personal element result in a clean country? And I think the answer is clearly not, because China's had corruption problems, not to be culturally insensitive, but I think it's important to be clear about these things. So the argument that it's just a cultural factor, I don't think makes sense. Is culture absolutely critical? Yes, and I talk to my clients about this, because culture is basically the operating system of an organization. So, you know, I'm talking to you on a laptop. I can't see the operating system, but it's definitely there, and it pretty well governs everything that this laptop can and can't do. And it's quite difficult to change it. So if the culture is take whatever you can, then when people come into the organization, this happens with the police in Malaysia, for example. So the police are pretty heavily corrupted here. So you get idealistic young cadets coming in wanting to make a difference. And then within 5 years, they're just part of the problem because the culture has configured them. And normally it takes a great deal, it takes well-written policies, but especially heavy duty enforcement to change the culture. How to establish the culture? I think really a well-executed program of the type that I've laid out for you, I think that's definitely useful. I was talking to Mercedes-Benz a few years ago. We did a session there, Mercedes Malaysia. Mercedes had a big incident in, I think it was about 2003, around then, 2004. And when I talked to the CEO of the Malaysian operation, this was about 2014, he said it had taken 10 years for Mercedes to change their way of doing business. 10 years, and that's a top performing multinational. Siemens, who got hit quite heavily in 2008, from what I've heard, haven't really changed that much. Despite the program, despite the fines, despite all the training, they don't like it. They have to do it, but they don't like it. So, so that cultural component of how we do things in this company, that's very, very deeply entrenched, and it takes a huge amount of effort to change that. So it takes time. We find with our clients, they always tell us everything's fine, of course, and then you dig around and find lots of problems. I think what we're doing with these programs gets the ball rolling, but it'll probably take a number of years before it really does kind of have the necessary impact. So the answer, Robert, is we try and shape the culture. That's really what it's all about. And if you can't shape the culture, then you're really wasting your time. Because yeah, if there's a battle between a policy and a culture, the culture wins, unless the policy is very aggressively enforced. Okay, Roberto, what percentage of Malaysian companies are implementing these compliance programs, and is there evidence that this is having an impact on corruption overall? Are there quantitative or qualitative data showing progress? Good, that's a very good question. Now, even with this new legislation in place, I would say maybe between 5 and 10% of companies, and those are bigger companies even, I would say. Now, actually, it was introduced as a listing requirement in December last year for companies to have an anti-corruption program. A lot of companies employed a law firm to write some policies and stick them on the website, which was the listing requirement, and that was it. So the adequate procedures that I just walked you through, they would do maybe 20% of that and hope for the best. I think that will change when the MACC start jailing company directors, which by all accounts will start happening next year. Now, there are about 600,000 active companies in Malaysia, but 90% of them employ less than 100 people. So that big mass of SMEs, I think that will take a lot longer. But generally speaking, they're quite flexible. They don't take so much to change them. They'll just go with what works in business. The real challenge is the big companies. I think it'll be another 3 or 4 years before all of them have a program. We have to see what that does to the corruptions perception index. And also, TI do a business integrity country agenda or BICA report. That probably would come out through that too. The surveys like the PwC Economic Crime Survey, they do them every 2 years. Right now, Malaysia, between 2014 and now, the crime survey for Malaysia showed that in 2014, I think it was, no, 2014, 19% of companies had experienced a corruption incident within the previous 2 years. By 2018, it had gone up to 35%. And when they did it this year, it was 35% again. So that survey might well show you the impact as well. So there are surveys being done. That survey is about 250 people, I think. So it's not huge, but it does at least provide some kind of guideline. I hope it has a more, but I think corruption, it takes decades really to fix properly. The question is, can you get if you look at the CPI index for Indonesia, it really shows what work Caprica have done. Because pretty well every year in the last 15 years, I think it is, the CPI has gone up from like 2.2 or 22%. I think it's about, I'm not sure what it is now, perhaps someone can tell us, 40%, something like that. But they definitely made a massive improvement. So it can work, but you've got to be determined. Okay, Roland, I'd like you to engage Roberto's thesis. Okay, yeah, to what extent is culture behind whatever success you're seeing? Or do the successes have more to do with pressure and structural solutions? I think I've managed to answer that. Is that right, Roland? Where's Roland on the picture? Okay, right. So I think we've covered that. I think we need both, but to change the culture, you need the structure and the enforcement. That's very clear. Okay, Robert again. Is there an organization analogous to yours that does this kind of work with government agencies? Actually, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, the MACC, they do some work, and the Institute Integrity Malaysia, they are also doing similar work with the government. The level of competence, I'm not sure about. Certainly IIM, we've heard some very not so good reports about IIM. MACC actually are a bit more competent, I would say, but the MACC are really the enforcement body, so they tend to do reviews and benchmarking for companies and for government agencies as well. They don't actually help them. Yeah, it's more the government side. We steer clear of government work because it's extremely difficult and quite risky commercially. They tend not to pay, for example, so we try and avoid doing work with them. Okay, Kelly, incentivizing compliance via punishment policies and peer pressure, yeah, versus having a personal disposition to virtue integrity. Okay, is that a statement, Kelly, or is perhaps you could just expand?
Yeah, thanks. No, it was just a statement and kind of representing what you were sharing about your approach and how to go after this too. Often in the church context or faith-based context, we go after dispositional virtue aspects as being the way forward. And that's helpful, but I think in combination, especially where I feel weak is a lot of what you're talking about, the nuts and bolts in a business context, multinational context, stuff like that, how to really make it operational. So thank you.
Yeah, I think, Kelly, we did a program with the Methodist Church of Malaysia. This was about 5 years ago. And honestly, it was a very different experience from dealing with corporates. I think in the business sector, people accept that people tend to do bad things, and how can you kind of hammer that out of them? And things like HR, rules and so on, that it's a much more aggressive environment in the corporate sector. And I think if people operate in the corporate sector, they kind of expect that. But the Christian sector is, I think, more idealistic in some ways. They expect more of people. But the downside in some ways, I think, is that they're reluctant to sometimes face the truth. And I think we saw this with the whole pedophile priests problem. The idea that priests would do such unspeakable things was just so impossible to imagine that people thought it just couldn't be the case until it came out that it really was the case and happening on a large scale. So I think, going back to Roberto's point about culture, the culture for Christian organizations is different. And one of the things we've really noticed is when we're going into a company, some companies have a very dynamic, very positive, enthusiastic culture. And what we don't want to do is go in as the kind of angel of death and kind of try and kill everybody and scare the living daylights out of them. And you do a training session and they all come in all buzzy and excited and what's this about? And then by the halfway through, they're slumped in their seats, wishing that they could die. So I've had that experience. So what we've had to do with that kind of company is present it much more in terms of personal positive integrity, with a little bit about, but if you do get this wrong, this is going to happen to you. Whereas other companies, if you're nice about it, they just won't pay attention at all. You've got to go in really kind of wielding the sword and saying, if you do this, you're going to die. If you do that, you're going to die. If you do the other, we're going to die. We're using AI, we're checking. We know what you're doing. The moment we can find out to prove it, we're going to string you up. That kind of approach. That's the only way you'll get their attention. But if you try that with a church organization, then people will probably run out of the room crying and leave the church, or at the very best, just shut the door and hope you go, and tell you to go away. So that kind of what is really going to work for this organization is very essential. I don't know, Roberto, if you've got any thoughts about this, how to tackle more church-based organizations versus commercial, because, talking about culture and so on.
Not really. I think it's a long conversation. I'm I'm not sure we have a lot of time. But as I think church, you know, I look at the external and the internal. It's the behavior within the church and the behavior outside of the church. Also, a lot of those church members are working in those same businesses that you are consulting with. So I think those practices that seem to be very accepted, legitimized in society, you know, are both an issue within the church and outside of the church in many cases. But I hear you. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the reaction, the mindset that church organizations and faith-based organizations have. No, so yes, I need to definitely tailor it to. I was wondering, I mean, on that note, to what other than the Methodists, have you worked with other church organizations, mega churches? You know, what experience you have in the sort of that, or faith-based organizations for that sake?
We haven't done much in that field. I think most churches, including mega churches, it's not something that they really want to think about, to be honest, and I don't blame them. I mean, frankly, the longer I spend in this industry, the more distasteful it becomes to me, because you're constantly dealing with just the worst, some of the worst elements of human nature. So people go to church to feel happy, they want to sing, you know, have a good time, meet their friends. They don't really want to think about the usher who is helping themselves to the collection plate. And they kind of think, well, if they're that desperate, perhaps they need the money. So it's different from the commercial sector, where money is, especially in Malaysia, money counts for everything, really. So no, they haven't really reached out to us. I think one thing that's a little bit sad is that some of the most corrupted companies in Malaysia are led by evangelical Christians. That's just disappointing, really. In fact, one high-profile company here, I was told specifically when I joined TI Malaysia, don't work with them, because if you do a program with them, you'll have lost your reputation from the word go, because they're such bad news. So, and these people are into health, wealth, and prosperity and hypergrace. So what we tend to find, and I noticed in that report, was it from this network about the Nigerian church, that when you get health, wealth, and prosperity and hypergrace together, basically it just becomes about making money. And if you're exploiting your workers and all the rest of it in the process, it doesn't matter, because you're already forgiven. So that combination is quite lethal for business ethics. And I've seen that firsthand here. Okay, I'm just aware that time's ticking away. I'd really like to get through all the messages if we can. So I'll just have a look through a few more. Do leaders of government agencies in Malaysia face fines or imprisonment if found guilty of corruption? In theory, yes. Like most countries, I think if you're very well connected, then you don't get prosecuted to the same degree. Oh, okay. Are you still with us, Martin, or you dropped off? Can't see you there. Yeah, okay, sorry, you just on my screen. Okay, so there you are, yeah. So the main Anti-Corruption Act, what I've talked about this evening is mostly about an amendment for corporate liability that's just come in. So the main Anti-Corruption Act of 2009 deals with individuals. So if individuals are on the take, then the MACC Act is there. And actually the MACC have been pretty good at prosecuting up to a certain level, but politicians are a bit exempt. The exception being if there's a change of government. So all the politicians who've been getting away with this for years suddenly found themselves in the dock when we had the change of government in 2018. And then we had the change of government again. And this year, suddenly they were let free. So, so that's how it works. I'm sure it's the same in most parts of the world. But the law is at least there, yeah. Business ethics differ significantly from ours. Yeah, that's why we don't like it. Exactly. I think, I mean, I'm from the corporate sector. So, Gilia, I think the corporate sector just operates on a fundamentally different basis, I think. I mean, I haven't talked really about Trident. Trident, I don't know if you're familiar with Hudson Taylor and the approach that he took, where he didn't ask for money. He just went out and preached and about the need and let people give. We have a little bit of the same approach with Trident. We don't really advertise. We kind of leave it to God to bring the projects to us, which some of my kind of fellow business people think is more or less economic suicide. And maybe that's one reason why we haven't grown more than we have. But I believe that we're here to do God's work, really. And God has always brought in the projects in some amazing ways. I can just perhaps mention briefly, 2 weeks ago, I got a text message out of the blue from a lady who'd been on one of my training courses, connecting me up to the director of one of the biggest trust funds in Malaysia. They have about $100 billion fund. And it just came in and says, I was talking to my friend, they're looking for a trainer on this. Can you do it? It's like, sure. This is a kind of nationally famous company. And we went in, got our proposal in and got it approved. So on Monday I got approval for that. And I didn't even, and I knew this called PNB it's an enormous national fund, and I didn't know anyone there at all. And then suddenly I'm training the board of directors in a month's time. So I've seen a lot of that kind of thing happen. A lot of business people, of course, money counts for everything. So it's a whole different ball game. But that goes back to culture, really. Those corrupt lawyers, yeah, okay. Note on UN General Assembly happening right now with an emphasis on multilateralism as well as the individual ability to create change, yeah, and doing so quickly. There's nothing in one of the main promo videos about the work of the UN, Urgent Solutions for Urgent Times, a decade of action on acknowledging and changing the cultures of corruption that undermine our best efforts for sustainable development and well-being. Okay, yeah, thanks. That's useful actually. Maybe Benji, could you email that link out? Because I think when we close the meeting, we lose the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, no, I've been saving some of the questions and the links being sent
okay.
to make sure that we're capturing. I do want to be thoughtful of time, and maybe if you could pick one more question to address. I mean, of course, a lot of these conversations are long and ongoing, but yeah, just I know a couple people have fallen off from meetings and
yeah, that's fair enough. We've overrun a bit, so
no worries.
Yeah. So note from Robert about cover-ups. Yeah, so a couple of things about the UN video. Yep, okay. So just quickly, Roland, the government organization is the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission. What keeps them and the agents honest? Good question. Is it a problem? Absolutely. They get corrupted too, but they're not too bad. It's mostly that they just get undercut all the time by their political overlords rather than they are actually corrupt, and they're not overly competent either. Strapline for Operation Nehemiah is foot washing, not finger pointing. Okay, yeah, see you, Martin, no problem. Yeah. So some comments from Michelle. I think this is very spot on. Yeah, so this high level of trust and also high levels of denial in the church environment, I think that's definitely a factor. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it takes a different approach to deal with corruption in the church, and also perhaps how church organizations go or deal with corruption when they are trying to attack it from other organizations. I think corruption in the church is a huge issue, and I don't think necessarily the ISO or what I've been showing you is directly relevant, but I think it could be adapted. And especially I think the adequate procedures approach, where you have that top level commitment, the risk assessment, the relevant controls, the monitoring and the training, I would guess that a tailored version of that structure could be useful, but you would need the church leaders to see the need for it. And from what I've seen, often the church leaders are the very people who aren't going to open the door because they like being in charge. They may have some kind of a board or oversight committee or elders, but the elders may have a light touch approach and give the church leader pretty well a free hand. I think one factor in the church community is this thing of God told me that such and such. So that doctrine, particularly in the charismatic church, I think that doctrine of direct personal revelation, which personally I do believe in. I mean, I've had that too. So I'm not saying that that's in any way unbiblical, but I think that can very easily be abused because you can have a church leader go in and say, God's told me that we have to build this building and we have to give the contract to my brother because he's a godly man and he'll do a good job. And that bypasses all the procurement and all the rest of it, just like that. So that kind of approach, that requires a very certain kind of response, I think, which needs to be doctrinal as much as practical. So, but I think the structure can still be applicable. I don't know, Robert, if I can see you nodding a few times, and Eddie as well. So we all know what we're talking about, right? And church people aren't free from, the three great temptations: money, power, and sex. So, and the church has a long and rich history of falling over itself in all three areas. So the church, whether it be Catholic or Protestant, has certainly had its long track record of rogues gallery for all three of those, but you know what, we're still here and we're still growing, and the world is still being evangelized. And so, clearly it's not a total disaster. But I do wonder that, the kind of the whole pedophile issue has obviously done enormous damage to the church, and it'll take a few generations to recover. So I think there are certain areas where power can be abused, and it's not to say you have to then clamp down with rigid governance systems all over the place, but maybe there's a way of doing this that can work, and some lessons from the corporate sector can help with that.